Next guest on the program, the last one, Ed Husic, Labor MP. Nothing auspicious about that, Ed Husic, so don't worry about it. But why don't we begin with Indonesia?
A great way to start, and nothing auspicious about it. You've got me in a good mood, so thanks.
I hope the lunch was a pleasant one. Really interesting speech, I thought, from Joko Widodo.
Yeah, it was.
Fleshing out what he wants to be a really strong relationship. The strongest, he sees Australia as Indonesia's strongest friend, which is very strongly.
These are important words that were uttered by the President, I thought. It signals in his mind how close he believes the two countries should be. I thought he gave a very thoughtful speech outlining some key priorities, half a dozen priorities that he thought that the two nations could work on, be it in relation to democracy and the value of pluralism and reinforcing democratic values at this point in time. Talked about economic cooperation, confronting the challenge of environmental, like climate change and environmental challenges as well. I thought his offer for us to work collaboratively within the Pacific too is very welcomed. And finally, building greater bridges between young people, because they will be the future leaders of our two great nations. I thought it was a very well, it was very well thought out and delivered speech, and it does, as I said, reinforce the value in their mind, in the Indonesians' mind as in ours, of our two nations working closer together.
It's been pretty febrile over the time, this relationship, for whatever reason. Does the coalition get some credit, 7 years in, which Labor points to, admonishing the coalition in many areas, that their leader feels like the relationship is in this sort of good stead?
I think, look, I would make the point that, as Anthony Albanese observed today in his contribution, that regardless of what side of politics forms government, there is a recognition across parties that this relationship is crucial between the two nations and that it needs to be continually strengthened. And, I noticed today that former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was present, and he was, as he was during the speech, and he did, to his great credit, invest a lot of personal energy to the relationship that I thought was important. I have to say, I was a little bit surprised leading into this visit, because we have here a nation of 250 million plus people, an economy that is going to soar up the G20 rankings, and we had hardly any coverage. In fact, it was lucky to get coverage today. To the great credit of the Australian, they made a substantive story on the front page.
Lack of media coverage, is that?
I have to say, if it was a Boris Johnson or a Donald Trump coming here, we would not be able to stop getting coverage of the imminent arrival of those two individuals. Someone like the President of Indonesia, I think, respectfully, deserves a lot more, given that they're coming here to ratify a trade agreement that will mean a lot to both Indonesians and Australians. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, a bit staggered with the lack of coverage. But again, good on the Australian, in words that rarely come out of my mouth, as my friends in the Australian know, but good on the Australian for putting it on the front page.
It'll ramp up, having been called their closest friend in that speech in Parliament, which certainly had a lot of people saying, well, that's interesting. What about coal? So a lot of talk today about this feasibility study. Are you happy to see this play out? This is part of the government's underwriting program, which can subsidise any sort of baseload power. That if this is a viable option, that it can go ahead without government money?
First, I want to see how this pans out, because we've seen in times past government announcements that don't necessarily work in this space. There's a lot of talk, I think, to try and placate, I suspect, the Nationals and the rebels within the National Party that have, in the last week, caused so much problem to coalition unity. While coal will play a part in the foreseeable future, the emphasis is on generating energy a lot more efficiently and cleanly. It really points to renewables taking up a greater share of the generation load. And I note my colleague Joel Fitzgibbon, and I absolutely endorse what he said this morning. We should not put 1 cent of government money
Does that
into
include a feasibility
subsidising.
Study as well?
Well, no. I mean, governments will put feasibility studies forward as to what happens as a result of it. It's another thing, but certainly, the emphasis has to be finding, as I said, better ways to generate energy and reduce emissions.
If there's a Healy option, as the plants are known as, the more modern ones, with maybe a carbon catch and storage, and it stacks up, Labor's got no ideological position on it?
Well, I have to say, I've watched some of these, the claims that, this form of generation that Healy can, fill the void or meet the demand. But the costs of doing this in some cases in the US have been quite extraordinary.
That'll be borne out, right, by this study?
Well, let's see what they say. But so far, I'm not necessarily convinced that Healy's the saviour that people are making out if you look at it purely on cost grounds. Again, while some people want to keep their minds open, they seem to be a lot more resistant. When you ask them to keep their mind open about renewables, it's not there. But when it's these other forms of energy generation that might be a lot more costly, they're asking us to keep our minds open, be it that or nuclear. And I just don't, at this stage, I haven't seen the numbers stack up.
What about nuclear? We export it. Why is there still this inherent issue with it if it's much lower emissions and it's base load?
A lot more people have been concerned about treatment, management of waste.
But is it justified? Aren't we one of the best countries in the world to do it from a political stability, geological as well? It seems a bit of an oddity that we're happy to mine the stuff and ship it off, but we couldn't possibly use it ourselves.
Well, I would just make this point, Tom. If it was so easy to do, why has it taken us so long to find a place to store the waste in this country? You're right, we do ship it off, but we don't want anywhere in the country, anywhere you propose to have a waste storage facility is met with a lot of resistance. And that's because the community has genuine concerns, rightly placed, about the management of waste post the use of this material. And if there's a better, more efficient way, like the time that it would take to build a nuclear reactor, get all the financing and regulatory approvals lined up to get that done, as opposed to bringing renewables online a lot quicker.
All right.
I just, again, on the numbers don't lie.
I'm getting what's called a hard rap in my ear, so I'll have to end it there.
Just when we're on a roll.
We'll talk in a couple of weeks. Ed Husic, thank you.
Okay.